This work is made from 1.5 millimeter birch ply, which is Finnish birch ply, which is even more special. This piece is essentially a swarm of elements. It is made up of naturally folded timber. I just wet it and fold it and put it into a jig. So apart from the cutting, there's a sort of choreographic flow to the way that it's made. I think it's important in some ways to mention with this body of work, which I've done over the last few years, I've been really asking myself, is sculpture necessary? Is it critical now? Is it something that you can justify material use? You know, because really it seems at times one is only adding to the series of objects that are commodified. So I was looking for a kind of criticality around my making. And in some ways, the question focused in this piece, particularly because it's about the nature of form and what form is, which I think is a critical question to ask in terms of sculpture. So this piece, its inner fins have a sort of geometry, which is kind of an early Euclidean geometry, very simple, beautiful sense of proportion. And then as it opens on its outer edge, which you can see there, it has these rasping sort of raggy edges, which are grasping the future in some way and finding new forms. So it has that volatility of being on the edge of formation. And it has this kind of energy and agency in itself because the spring of the folded timber still retains energy. I mean, when I was making it, I used to have to cover it with the cloth myself because it was too present, you know, it was building up a lot of presence. It was hand cut, each piece hand cut, because I wanted the minutiae of difference between sort of even mood on a day or particularities of the individual timber to come through so that it has that resonance, so that it has this oscillation of itself and it kind of claims its own territory in space. And it has that kind of porosity, which my work titled In Absence had in the Rubicon Gallery many years ago. So that sort of porosity is something that's embedded in my work. And really, it is about reaching a kind of an accommodation and an assimilation and a point of meeting with the body. First of all, it's a dystopian, it's landscape, it's kind of post-meltdown, when human presence has ceased to be on the planet, if you like, so that the matter and materiality has depleted to a register of two elements, one which is a horizontal landscape. And I chose to use plastic because plastic is essentially dead material. It's a real source of pollution, and it has a kind of bad name in terms of commodity. So I chose to almost construct an architectural landscape there with a heavy gauge blue plastic and a lighter gauge. So it naturally springs into this form. So there is that kind of reminiscent of a life force, but it's a reaction of one piece of dead material to another. It's a flexing of the last remnant of muscular life, if you like. Then on top I have styrofoam discs onto which I've poured plaster. For me, the moment of tension here is in the drip. So if you do come to the gallery to see the piece, just kind of absorb that. It's kind of like a fungal layer, and it's really a spent layer of habitation. So I titled it The Moon is Falling because the moon goes in an elliptical course around the Earth, and at times it appears to remove itself from the Earth's orbit. It falls away, but it does return because of its gravitational link. So this is really a ray of hope in a way that if we change how we're behaving, that we can pull things back into register. And there's a sort of commercial vividness and joy and a little bit of faux activity on the blue. It's quite gay, it's very colorful, but it's, to me, because it mimics corporate kind of treats, things that you buy that are unnecessary, are very seductive. So it has a seductiveness, but I suppose underneath it, it's a prospect that needs to be imagined. The tension of the blue plastic against the lighter gauge white plastic, if you lift it into place, it carries the gesture of your hand in some way, it tensions into the piece. So I discovered that if I put a handle of a sweeping brush and just twirl it, it will form its own relaxed condition, which is, yeah, it's just one of those finer points of materiality and how things behave and how to induce things to behave the way you want them to behave. Sometimes you have to remove your hand and allow the innate agency in the material to guide itself. The title of the show, A Consequence Of, was about that acceleration of consequence of what we're doing now and how it impacts and a kind of it generates a particular direction into the future, which, and I think, you know, this is kind of getting back to the original question: what kind of things can sculpture do? What kind of questions can they raise, or vistas can they spread out before us that maybe other art forms don't do in quite the same way? And I think the criticality of sculpture is that you're actually using the same materials the world is made of, that there's a sort of an engagement with the with human engagement with matter, which is, I think, a critical question, or questions around how we engage with matter. You know, aluminium is the most extraordinary low glow, which is really something, it has some sort of spiritual element to it. It's really extraordinary. And it's so light, it has that kind of sense of almost non-material. And then I used a special fluorescent paint, and then I'm using mirror glass and plastic. So the whole thing has a dematerialization going on, where there's a lot of reflection, a lot of a very light draw, you know, the kind of normal kind of vigor or ambition of line has been spent from this piece. It's kind of languid. The lines escape a little part from a generated point outwards. This piece, this is a very studio little small image of it, but it's one of the pieces I've made, the new works I've made for Hugh Lane, and I'm looking forward to installing it. The sort of colored flat pieces behind the three elements.
Yeah.
And that's 1.5 birch, which I love as a material. It's kind of, it's got ground and it's got pigment and it's got a wood base. It's that sort of reference, but it's also very Albers. I had Catherine Boyk taught me interaction of color or class in school, and it was hugely influential on me. I still carry it very much, that sort of basic step forward. So that has a reference to historical references in Albers as well. And then the rest of the elements in them are found. Some elements have been like the little wires. These were from wrapped steel as it came from the steel yard. So I suppose the whole piece is really a consideration of all the different layers and types of agency, you know, things that are historical, things that are layered into contemporary practice or earlier practice, things that are found, things made, and how the world is a complex, dappled affair. So I was very drawn to Hopkins' poem in that. And then when I went, you know, I mean, this body of work as it evolved from Without Stilling, the first piece we looked at, through to the second show in the dock, which was called A Breather of Air. Somehow I was trying to find where I was going. And in the end, I chose the title, A Dappled World, to be the final, which was present in the first show, but I didn't recognize it as being where I was going. That often happens. So that piece became the signatory piece for this show, and also forms part of, I don't know, 5 or 6 pieces I have in the atrium space in Hugh Lane, which itself is a sort of strange space. It's it's between the historical building and the new wing, and it has a sort of deviational kind of aspects where there's a hanging wall, a stair, and this fabulous big wall that seems to sweep up to the ceiling. So it reminded me of the Thingvellir in Iceland, which is a geological fault. And, you know, things are extruded through this fault, and the landscape on either side settles. So there's a sort of an unsettlement and a movement of objects and questions around material matter that flow through that space, while the other galleries then I'm treating as kind of landscapes or tableaus, like the moon is falling and without stilling. They're all going to kind of hover around this fissure, if you like. This is a second riff, is a word that I hear people using, but yeah, it's a second take. So I called it And Bone Revisited. And when I was saying and bone, I was thinking of Richard Sennett's book, Flesh and Bone, Flesh and Stone, but this is and bone. But it was nevertheless the idea of a structure onto which flesh adheres. And that's very much about, it's a condition that there is some basic structural element and that other materials play on it. And in some ways, I think of architecture as having that elemental aspects to it. The engineering in this is very simple. From the little foot and the base to the T section is a tensile steel wire, which is tightened with a turnbuckle. So the piece is supported by the tension between the base and that point, which I really like, you know, that it has an inherent tension. Yeah. That the engineering itself is almost musical, you know, it's very incisive. And then the materials, which are almost like materials that are discarded on a site. The anxiety about architecture, I suppose, is an anxiety I have about all of the aestheticization and cultural values that we hold dear, including architecture, that are somehow abrasively treated and not appreciated. And perhaps even within architecture, with population increase, the kind of such a pressure on architecture to produce systemization. And if it's not an open responsive system, then it becomes an incarceration. So there are all these kind of things, but also I think that this is if you can see the little foot there, which is a package, you know, those air packages. So I cast that, but it is a reference to Roman architecture, the column or something. So it has a sort of, it could have been a plan, but sometimes you think that plans are like embodiments of, they are like bodies. They you know, and they have a particularly graphic quality all of their own, which I enjoy because they're aspirational. But the plastic itself is a form of plan, but it's also, it's almost like an amputation of body, and it's falling over the piece. We are evolved from and cohabiters with all materials, and we have to realize the agencies of what we supposedly call inanimate materials. I mean, all you have to think about is the smallest COVID bug and how it kind of unsettled our worlds, our economies, our trajectories, our ambitions, our work. You know, there are other things out there that have a form of volition, which we're not really acknowledging. We imagine that we're the only people that think, or you know, that's the wrong way of saying it, but that
that are animated or
there are other forms of will active, you know, with besides our own, and we need to begin to harness and enter into a different consciousness around material matter. That's what my work is investigating, really.